Good morning, and welcome to our second session looking at security beyond the application. I'm Tom Venables, Director of our Application and Cybersecurity Practice, and I'm really pleased today to be joined by David Higgins from CyberArk to talk about one of the most vital elements of increasing the security of our estates, that of governing the privileged accounts with all of the keys to the kingdom. Today we're going to talk about what the challenges are for privileged access, what role it plays within the attack chain, how privileges can be exploited, and some areas to consider for protecting ourselves. We recently conducted a joint survey with CyberArk of SAP customers and showed that there is still room for improvement in this area. Many of us are familiar with the emergency access scenarios within the application, but I'm not sure we necessarily know who has root access to servers or the database administrator accounts. There's more to securing the systems and data than just the application. And with that, I'd like to hand over to David to introduce himself and take us through it. Thanks, David.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dom, and good morning, everybody. So yeah, as mentioned, David Higgins, EMEA Technical Director at CyberArk. I've been with the company for about 11 years now, and as you can obviously tell from the title of the session, I've been focusing in the privileged access space for that period of time. And I'm going to go through a few things, as you can see on this slide. I wanted to start off, as all good presentations do, right, with some statistics. And the first statistic is really just to kind of bring some relevancy around the importance of privilege and identity, especially when we consider the attack chain. And looking at various different, analysis and research results, etc. I've taken the one here from the Verizon data breach investigation report, which says in 80% of data breaches, there was the involvement or requirement for an attacker to steal credentials. And I think it'd be remiss of me not to mention if this is reflective of, a kind of more traditional on-premise environment, or of course, does this change as digital transformation and cloud adoption takes place? And statistics there, it's almost a rounding error, kind of echo the same value, right? It's when we look at incidents specifically related to cloud platforms, it's pretty much 80%, right? It is, as I say, it's a rounding error. It depends if you're in a glass half full or glass half empty kind of mind, if we go to 70 or 80. But the point is, and this is something I'm going to highlight on the next slide, there's a commonality in a lot of the attacks and breaches that we see today. Different motives, different agendas, of course, from the attacker, different intrusion mechanisms and different ways they'll find their way into an environment or into an application, and perhaps a different objective. But there's this commonality that we're going to kind of touch on today and talk about its relevancy when we think about SAP and business critical apps, is at some point, the attacker is going to want to steal credentials, as we saw from the statistic. Why is it going to do that? Well, with a credential in hand, it's going to allow the attacker to either escalate privileges or perform lateral movements. To do that initial intrusion, and of course, I'm sure many of you are aware that initial intrusion could be phishing, but it's not the only way in, of course. External facing systems and various other techniques could allow an attacker into the environment. And if you're concerned about the insider threat, well, that initial intrusion just isn't required. But with that harvesting of credentials comes lateral movement, moving deeper into the environment. And this is something I'll explore a little bit in detail as well, or to escalate privileges and ultimately trying to get to their objective. I've reflected the objective here as tier 0. And I think when we consider things like SAP, that naturally would fit into something that is very critical to the business, not just in terms of its availability, but also, of course, the sensitivity of some of the data stored within there. So as I say, this is the kind of commonality that we see within the attack chain, and therefore the importance of identity within it. So I've put in the title identity within the attack chain, but as you can imagine, the attackers are always going to cover the most privileged, the highest administrative levels of accounts when they're going through this process, right? If they can compromise, say, a domain administrator, think about the routes from a lateral movement perspective that are made available, right? Any device now in that domain is open to the attacker to access, and access with admin rights. So they're always looking for the most privilege. And this process that you see here, I've done as kind of one directional arrows, but usually this is cyclic. It's happening multiple times in the attack process. We're all aware of that kind of reconnaissance process that the attacker's doing. Looking for credentials and privilege is part of that reconnaissance. What's available to me? What can I use? Right, leverage that, move to the next position, repeat the process until they find a way into wherever their objective may be. Now, Tom mentioned as well that we did some a recent survey of SAP customers looking at the challenge of privilege and how kind of super user access is being managed. And you can see a couple of statistics on the slide right now, which you probably don't need me to read through. But I think that there's an interesting thing that we wanted to kind of talk about when it comes to, say, super user, admin, privileged user access, however you want to frame it, is that really there's two aspects to consider. There is the front door, right? That is admins actually going into the application, and that might be named users. Of course, it could be kind of firefighter style access. But then there's also all this stuff behind the scenes, right? Which the application itself is running on. Infrastructure, databases, all that fun stuff, which also itself has highly privileged administrative users who are responsible for maintaining those systems. And that's where I'm going to focus a lot of the conversation today, is kind of that behind the scenes thing. And there's two flavors of that, right? So if we make that attack chain more centric around critical apps, and of course, SAP being one of those, this kind of, I'm sorry, I've used an acronym because from a security vendor. Acronyms is kind of just in our DNA. There's another acronym. It just kind of falls out, right? There's two flavors of these, of SAP and other business critical apps, which is you're running it, it's self-hosted, or of course there's moving more to a SaaS-based model. Now, in the situation where it's running in your own environments, it could be your own AWS Azure, or of course on-prem data center. You've got all this underlying infrastructure that it's going to be sitting on. And so really that route that you see, right, is that initial intrusion, whatever it may be over here, onto the endpoint, search for credentials, perform lateral movement, repeat until they get to perhaps the underlying database or the underlying servers that it's sitting on. Getting to those systems with highly privileged access is, of course, going to put the attacker in a unique position to execute on their objective. Now, if their objective is to cause disruption and remove the availability of that system, of course, hugely damaging for yourselves. If that objective is actually start harvesting some of the data that's available from that kind of back-end system, then again, of course, huge implications from that side of things. And you'll notice, and again, I always have to apologize for these kinds of icons, right? They're always looking very menacing, these kind of would-be attackers. But I've also reflected that the malicious insider. And if you go to Google and you search, disgruntled employee or disgruntled, insider causes damage, more often than not, they're actually an IT administrator who didn't get the promotion they wanted, didn't get the pay rise, unhappy about something, and they're exploiting open admin access that they have. Now, the other flavor I mentioned is where perhaps you're consuming something like this as a service, right? And so the challenge and the concern doesn't necessarily go away; it just manifests in a different form. So think about, integration that you're doing with these platforms, right? Data export processes, integration with other services, everything that's going to communicate then to that service. Well, there's an authentication needed. And that authentication is in itself a credential of some description and likely going to be privileged in terms of what it can see and what it can do when it gets that level of access. So these are the points we're going to explore a little bit today. The first thing that I wanted to highlight as well is of course well understood and well documented, but things have of course changed over the last year or so. I'm not sure what Boris is actually doing in this photo, but with everything happening in the Tory party right now, who knows, right? But the point of this slide is to say, our working environment's changed. We're all still, majority of us working from home. Offices are starting to open up a bit more, but most organizations I've spoken to have said, look, we're probably not going to be 100% working from home moving forward, but hybrid is likely the way forward. So we're going to get in a situation where the users of that access that's coveted by the attackers are now working in many different environments, arguably less secure environments than when they were sat, of course, within the office. So we're getting to this, well publicized, well documented position of, the traditional perimeter dissipating. And we've got all these systems over here. Of course, we're concentrating really on things like SAP today that will have different users, different personas that need to interact with it with a form of privilege that, of course, could be coveted. So, we mentioned about the front door access, right? So you've got the application users themselves logging in with certain levels of access. Of course, that's something we need to protect. appropriate processes such as strong multi-factor authentication go a long way in this situation. But then think about that kind of behind the scenes scenario I was talking about. So third parties, how many of you outsourcing capabilities and support functions to a third party supplier? They will then need access to perhaps the underlying infrastructure or the application itself. How is that access achieved? And of course, what's the level of privilege that they're ascertaining with that access? Supply chain attacks, of course, very well documented this year, right? Many examples I could talk about there. We, of course, have developers. It's, I think, been said many times, most companies are software companies these days, right? We're all developing applications either for internal use or for use for our business and externally facing. And I mentioned briefly in that kind of attack chain where it's, you know, a SaaS hosted application, you've got, you know, integrations taking place, code talking to these systems. There's an authentication that's needed. How secure is it, the environment that the developers themselves are working in? But also importantly, when they're building these integrations and building this authentication process, how secure is that? Are we looking at a situation of hard-coded credentials and secrets? Because again, going back to the stat, going back to the attack chain, we know attackers are going to look for credentials, and if they find a piece of code with a hard-coded key in it, API key, or even worse, a plain text password, lateral movement becomes, of course, so much easier. And then lastly, the guys and the girls that are keeping the lights on, the underlying administrators of your environment, your database administrators, your infrastructure support staff. These are the guys and girls that are going to be logging on as full admin to the back-end systems of which your critical apps are running on. Now, they, of course, shouldn't be seeing data. They shouldn't, of course, be disrupting the service. Their role is a genuine one to maintain and keep these systems operational. But think about the access that they're achieving it with. Usually, it could be an account that you've dropped into an AD group that gives it admin rights to a collection of servers. It could be they're simply logging into databases as sys or the full admin account for that database. It allows them to do what they need to do, which is great. But of course, it becomes very coveted access if the right controls aren't put around the way that they can achieve that access. Are those credentials being rotated on a regular basis, as an example? So these are the things I'm going to dive into a bit more detail. And actually, I'm going to try and break it down into 3 different areas. So here's a different manifestation of that attack chain and the 3 kind of typical things I see happening, you know, in those processes. And what I want to do is focus in 3 different areas and talk about some kind of practices and approaches that we can do to protect the way that access is delivered, make sure the users can do all the personas and all the roles that we just talked about, but actually keeping those credentials and that access out of the hands of the attacker. And I'll break it down into these 3 elements, and where possible, give you an example about where things could go wrong. So starting from the middle, this is actually where I'll start, which is, of course, securing the underlying infrastructure and operations side of things. We've got admins logging onto servers. You know, are the credentials being rotated? What is the route that they take themselves to access that infrastructure? So I'll give you some examples there. Looking at the workforce themselves, as mentioned, they're working from anywhere these days in the hybrid world. But then also looking at cloud and automation and the role that plays as we look at our critical apps and the sensitive data contained within. So we're going to dive into that middle section. Just bear with me as I have a sip of water. And as mentioned, what I intend to do is try and give you an example of where things can go wrong in each of these 3 specific areas. So starting with digital transformation, the first thing to kind of call out is human beings are human beings, right? And social engineering is specifically designed to exploit human nature. Statistics here, this is, I will apologize, this is a fairly old statistics, but one that is continually echoed. So, you know, the number may change, but the point is still relevant, is that there's always going to be a collection of users that will at some point click on any given phishing campaign, right? That will be the incorrect link, opening an inappropriate attachment, getting the prompt to run a macro and still saying, yeah, let's run it. And away things kind of go. The point here is security education is hugely important, and I certainly do not want to downplay that. I think it plays a massive role in organizations. Better awareness, mitigate the chances of phishing campaigns getting through. My point with this statistic, though, is we kind of have to plan that they will get through because, you know, phishing campaigns are becoming more targeted. We are seeing more spear phishing campaigns, which means these are more thought through, more specifically targeted, and designed at, a higher fruition, a higher success rate for the attacker. So yes, of course, there's always things that we can do to decrease the likelihood of a phishing campaign being successful, but we almost in a security position have to take the risk posture that it's going to happen. So not an if, but a when type mindset. And the example I have here is a transition from phishing campaign all the way through to a critical business app. Now, I haven't targeted this on SAP. I've actually moved this into the financial services world. And this, for those who are familiar with it, is a reflection of the Bangladesh central bank heist that happened a few years back. It resulted in multi-millions being lost. They've recouped some of it, but certainly not all of it. But what I wanted to point out here is that transition from an internet externally facing endpoint, a victim of a phishing campaign, and then the attackers traversing through the network, getting to what was or is arguably a very critical system for that bank, which arguably had many different aspects of security, but still the attackers found their way through. And how did they do it? Continually looking for privileged credentials to perform lateral movement and elevate their rights. Some of the reports I read on this incident said that lateral movement actually occurred 32 times. So that means 32 different times the attackers found an identity, harvested its credential, and used it to connect to another system. So impersonating that privileged account, and remained undetected. And it's kind of understandable why, if there aren't appropriate controls in place, because they're connecting as, in some cases, shared accounts, right? Something like administrator, admin, root, or an application support, infrastructure support account that's used on a regular basis. And seeing the wood from the trees becomes really difficult. When do we know that authentication was legitimate? When do we know that authentication was malicious? And unfortunately, in this case, they weren't able to differentiate. And 32 times later, they got on to what was, for those familiar with kind of the Swift environment, they got onto the Swift payment infrastructure and started to transact some bogus requests and actually shift a lot of money into their accounts in the Cayman Islands and various other different places. And it was only, in fact, wasn't security that stopped this. It would have been a much more impactful attack in terms of monetary loss, but it was actually a spelling mistake that was detected by a diligent German bank that actually stopped this being a more impactful attack from a financial loss perspective. So wanted to set the scene there and then kind of talk about things. How can we protect then the underlying infrastructure that our critical apps sit on? Well, there's a few things I'd kind of recommend, right? And it's called out from those learnings we saw in the survey before. So again, on the left-hand side here, right, we have our user community, which could be anywhere in the world. It could be some of you are also outsourcing the underlying infrastructure support itself, right? So I've included third parties in this discussion. They're going to want to need access to systems over here. And they're going to be doing that, as I say, with highly privileged accounts, which they need, of course, to maintain, to patch, to upgrade. So here's a few things that I kind of recommend that we can do to mitigate some of those risks. Firstly, take those privileged accounts, like admin, like root, but domain admin, service accounts, etc. Secure them and make sure they're being regularly rotated to something that's strong, unique from a password perspective. Because often these accounts, although highly coveted, and actually probably larger in number than employees, usually have the lowest amount of control around them. We probably make all our employees change their AD password every 30 or 90 days. It's unlikely in many cases, without privileged access processes in place, the same thing's happening with these highly privileged accounts. So first step, take those accounts, secure them, rotate them, and make sure there's something strong and unique and complex. That means if an attacker does somehow get hold of a credential, well, we're regularly rotating them. We're rotating them after use. So they may steal a credential in a hash location, perhaps from the LSAS process on a Windows server, but it's invalidated because regular rotation, one-time password usage is in place. What this then does immediately is it creates a control point. Now, basically, our administrators, our developers, third-party staff, when they want access to those systems on the right, they need to come to the PAN platform. Strong authentication, workflow approval processes can be enforced, but also we need to consider that root. Think about the attack chain I showed you before. Externally facing endpoint, internet connection, human being, arguably a dangerous combination, resulting in a phishing campaign, and then they traversed through the network and got to a critical system. That meant there was network routes available from external endpoint to critical app. So the second thing really is to consider that and think about isolation. So what we mean by this is isolating those internet connected devices from what's most critical to your business. And we have this conversation a lot with kind of post-breach organizations. Their mindset very much being, look, we were the victim of attack. They got through social engineering. It's going to happen again. We can't categorically stop that from happening. So actually our approach is now about remediation, kind of impact, reducing the impact radius, right? It's all about isolation, stopping the attacker moving from that exposed endpoint and getting to their objective. So this is things where like brokering and jump servers come into play. Rather than releasing a password and allowing a user then to directly connect to a critical asset, putting them through a hop. So then we are actually starting to isolate that endpoint from what's critical. So if an attacker does get on the endpoint and now starts performing reconnaissance and seeing what's routes available to them, it's much more reduced, unlikely, of course, to be able to traverse through, as we saw before. And then wrapped around all of this, you can now start to put detection. That the Bangladesh Central Bank I mentioned before, 32 times lateral movement happened without being able to see the wood from the trees, knowing if an authentication as a privileged account was legitimate. Now that you've got a control process in place, the users are going through MFA approval and having their sessions brokered. We should therefore know that all privileged activity for these users on the left-hand side are going through that process. Anything that doesn't, well, that's what we want to let the SOC know about. That's what we want to raise alerts about, because that's somehow, an attacker in the network that's compromising credentials and trying to circumvent controls. They're, of course, not going to kindly MFA into a PAM platform and make a legitimate request for a session, right? Or actually, it could also be an insider who just simply doesn't want to go through the security controls. Either way, once you put the control place enforced, we can start detecting any circumventions and anomalies associated to that. And of course, final point here is where possible, we should always be striving to a position of least privilege. You go onto the NCSC's website, you go over to the US and the NSA's website, the principle of least privilege is echoed in whatever country in the world you find yourselves in, right? It is one of those kind of key aspects of security. And we should always be looking at, well, the access these users are getting, is there any way that we can reduce it and make it more aligned to their role? Why? Well, if that identity is compromised, again, we limit what someone could do with it. Okay. So I'm going to touch on the two other areas, probably in a little bit less detail, but also just to kind of reinforce the point of where we can think about protecting ourselves against that attack chains that I've spoken about so far. So the other area, I'm moving into more the automated side of things. That discussion previously was very much about human being and their access, but we also have automated processes, application code, etc. An example of a breach here was a company called CodeCov, who obviously supply services to the customers. I've just noticed the screens are moving ahead, so I'll quickly pause. And actually what happened here, and I'll do it very quickly, is they actually compromised the organization themselves and made a small change to their source code, which they knew was going to be downloaded and pushed out to their customers. It was a single line of code that they changed. And all they actually did, the attackers, is to have all the variables that are running in the code on the customer's environment uploaded to their server. Why were they interested in variables? Well, usually when a developer is writing some form of ways and means for their code to authenticate to something, it's going to retrieve a secret, it's going to retrieve a key, a credential, and then they're going to write that to a variable so they can continually refer back to it. So the attackers kind of knew, well, if we can get hold of all the valuables stored in the variables within the code, well, then we're probably likely going to get our hands on some credentials. We're probably going to get our hands on some powerful secrets, which link to everything that we've talked about so far. So machines, automated processes, communicating, of course, to our critical business apps, communicating to our backend systems also play a role here for consideration. The kind of suggested controls are very similar, right? They're going to want keys and secrets, credentials. Let's secure them. Let's make sure they're being rotated on a regular basis. Let's make sure we put secure authentication processes so that it is the genuine app requesting access. And let's also try and remove, credentials being stored in variables and hard-coded within, code itself, because again, that supplies a very good source of attack for the attackers. The point being is we can't just purely focus on the human users. We also need to think about any automated processes that we have in our environment. There's a lot of technical aspects with what I'm showing you on this slide, but of course, reach out to the guys at Turnkey, right, and they'll help you to get that detailed information. Okay. Final point, I mentioned 3 areas, is the endpoint itself, right? And most attacks start at the endpoint. I could chuck at you a whole selection of different types of attacks that start at the endpoint. So I kept it relatively high level just with this simple statement, who I think probably most of you agree with. The point here is, think about your individuals. They're working anywhere in the world, as we've talked about already. Are they running with local admin rights on their workstations? Perhaps majority of your workforce aren't, but you'll have exceptions, I presume, to policy. Developers, your IT administrators, the kind of users we've been talking about that are regularly targeted are also those individuals that are probably running with local admin rights on their workstation. Why is that important for a would-be attacker? Well, the clicking of that link, the opening of attachment, execute with admin permissions. All right, it's something they cover to escalate privileges, run with admin rights. So when we look at the endpoint, this is also something we need to consider, is what can we do to help protect that environment? Well, there's a few things here, right? Firstly, strive towards a position that nobody has local admin rights. There's actually, and it's a side topic to this theme, right? But there's actually a large percentage of ransomware which simply won't run if it doesn't have admin rights. There's a high percentage of credential theft tools that won't run if it doesn't have admin rights. So by categorically removing local admin rights from our workstations, we put ourselves in a strong position to, again, starting to isolate those internet connected devices from what's most critical to our business. If we remove local admin rights, there's other stuff we need to think about: just-in-time elevation, application control, allowing those users to do what they've needed to do, because that's the reason they're running with admin rights in the first place. They complained. They stopped them doing their job. So if we take it away, we have to, of course, take with one hand and give with the other. So that's where things like application control and just-in-time elevation come into play. Allow the developers to run Visual Basic or .NET or whatever it is. You also see a reference here to privileged defense. We know the endpoint is probably the initial intrusion, not always, but very likely. But we also know it's very unlikely to be where the attack finishes. They're going to want to harvest credentials. So by enforcing technology that can detect attempts to steal credentials, proactively block it, even put fake accounts out there as in a kind of privilege law, like bait almost, will give us that jumpstart that we know someone malicious is in our network and trying to do something untoward. There's a throwaway comment there to ransomware protection, because if you do all those things you see on the screen, it actually is an incredible defense against ransomware propagating through your environment. Other things to consider is, of course, this all then links to secured remote privileged access, right? Securing the way that those individuals are getting into the heart of your business. But also, where possible, making sure that they're always using strong authentication, single sign-on where we can to facilitate their user experience. Try to, where we can, move to a passwordless world. I've mentioned passwords a lot. We want to move to passwordless. In many situations, we can't because the underlying environments simply don't allow it. But passwords themselves, it was something the computer password was invented in the 1960s. Yet we're still relying it today in 2021, which is crazy. I don't see that disappearing, but I feel for the end user, for the workforce, there's a lot that we can do to take passwords out of their world. And that's, again, going to make the life of an attacker a lot more difficult. So just to summarize on a couple of points that I've made, one of them is kind of that assumed breach, phishing campaigns, etc. They're going to get in. So what can we do to isolate and prevent the attacker getting to our business critical applications, right? And so I mentioned a few things, right? Protect those credentials, isolate internet connected devices from what's most critical, put in the right detection capabilities, and of course, focus on the most coveted credentials, the domain admins, the service accounts, so on and so forth, because they've got highly privileged access, far-reaching access, which of course are going to be targeted. And that kind of think like attacker mindset really drives us to locking away the crown jewels, SAP and your other critical apps, right? Treating them in that tier 0 mindset. And some of you probably are regulated organizations and therefore have to deliver certain evidence and audit to the regulators. My point here is to think more about how the attacker themselves would try to get into those environments, because it's very different than just generating the right visibility and accountability that perhaps the regulators want. It's thinking about all the different routes that they may take. For example, going after domain admin, going after some hard-coded credentials and scripts and codes, thinking about the ways and means that they may try to find routes into your business critical apps. So I hope you found that useful and interesting. I hope I didn't go too fast. I did have a very large cup of coffee this morning. But here, Tom, I'm going to pause and just see if we've any questions come in.
Absolutely. And thank you, David. Really interesting as ever, and hopefully insightful for everybody. I always get a little bit paranoid whenever we discuss the capabilities of the attackers here. But yeah, we've had a few questions in. The first of which is, how do we know what privileged accounts exist, which we can't see? So if we're application administrators, how do we know what is supporting the architecture?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question, and I'd love to say there's a very simple switch that you just suddenly magically know where all those accounts are. Discovery becomes hugely important. So there are tools, and look, putting my CyberArk hat on, we have a free discovery tool that the guys at Turnkey can give you access to, which will from the infrastructure side scan and discover where privileged accounts are. We also created one for SAP, which you can download from our website as well. And the idea is to get a visibility of what privileged accounts exist right now. And you're always going to find things you weren't aware of. And I think that's kind of where the question was leading to. The second thing is, we can do lots of discovery and try and find things. But then secondly, once we've got an idea of what we believe exists, putting that kind of control process in, which is, well, look, moving forward, this is how privileged access should take place. And then once we've done that, we can put detection in place. So let's say you've got a SIEM platform, that can send information to your PAM tool, right? It can send log-on events. So the idea being, we've discovered what we can, we've onboarded and protected it, but now we're going to try and discover any access that happens with accounts we don't know about. So perhaps we can't discover and find everything, but we can, by integration of different technology, discover access that's happening, and that may alert us to accounts that perhaps we've missed.
Absolutely. And it is that integrated, so the CISO and the application security worlds coming together to secure this element, right?
Absolutely.
Another good question here. You mentioned that in your presentation that privileged accounts often outnumber employees. And how is that the case?
Good point. So once upon a time, I said I've been at CyberArk 11 years. We used to say it was 3 to 4 times the number of privileged accounts to human users. And I actually think that ratio is much higher. And just think about it, right? So every employee in your organization perhaps has a workstation. Straight away, there is a built-in admin account to it. We then have to network those devices so they can communicate to services. So now you've got routers and switches, built-in admin accounts there. We then, of course, create service accounts, domain admin accounts, various accounts. More privilege, we create applications, we build databases, we build everything I've mentioned has a built-in account, and then we create even more on top to provide operational support, infrastructure support, so on and so forth. So when you start to think of it that way, it's very easy how we can start to get a number that actually far exceeds our kind of day-to-day human user IDs.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And, within even the application layer itself, I know we're looking beyond that, but we've got system and communication accounts proliferating all over the place. And that's only going to increase as the network infrastructure expands, and we're talking to more cloud services. We've got more connections into the crown jewels. It's not that difficult to see how they proliferate so much. A good one here. Should we be mandating that our third parties go through PAM processes to access our infrastructure and servers? Is there an alternative, as that can need a lot of business change?
Yeah, it's a good point, because I think a lot of organizations I spoke to that have third parties and suppliers coming somewhere in the contractual agreement that they'll do some form of privilege management. Right, and it could be when you scratch under the surface that they just have a spreadsheet and they just put some passwords in that spreadsheet, and for them that's their tick in the box. I'm not saying that's the case for all suppliers, right? But I have seen it happen. So if it's possible, absolutely, because what we have to consider with the third party and the suppliers is we could, of course, enforce no security on their environment and where they're coming from. We don't know what they've clicked on. We don't know what they've opened. So absolutely, where we should be ensuring that those users, even if they've got a VPN access into your network, don't then have from that position a jump point straight onto the infrastructure they're supporting. We need to try and sandbag and isolate whatever initial kind of connectivity they get to your environment to where they want to go, so we can have that kind of reassurance that there isn't that direct transition from where they are to what's critical and what they're supporting. So absolutely, I think where we can, we should be trying to put our third-party suppliers through privileged access controls. Arguably, it's one of the higher risks as well, and they're likely doing it with very privileged access. So where it's possible, for sure, there is, of course, business change. But actually, I'd also argue sometimes they're the easier targets. Forgetting the contractual stuff,
yep.
When we talk about privileged access management, we are, of course, changing the way that users access systems. We try and make that as native and frictionless as possible, but it's security, right? There is going to be an element of change. Enforcing change on your own employees is probably more difficult than it is enforcing change on, a third party who arguably you are a customer of, and therefore there is more propensity to enforce change on them.
Yeah, really good point. Another one here. You talked about modifying code to expose credentials, and that extends a little bit to code injection and those sorts of attacks. Mm-hmm. To what extent can we secure against that element? Are there any specific indicators that we're looking for?
Yeah, from putting my privilege hat specifically on, some of the basic stuff is just making sure that we don't have anything that's simply hard coded or referenced directly in the code that relates to authentication, right? It sounds silly, right? But we see it all the time. It might be that in the code you see username and password of a database, including the instance details, right? So that's everything the attacker needs to now get onto that database. It could be that, if you've moved and you're transitioning into the cloud, that we're seeing API keys for AWS and Azure, etc. Again, hard coded. There's all kinds of examples of breaches where code's been uploaded to things like GitHub and has those hard-coded secrets in them, to the point that GitHub themselves now try and scan repositories to highlight this to you. Yeah. So from an indicator, it's looking for those simple things to start with and trying to provide the developers with a common secure way to access a credential.
Yeah, I should add as well that there are code scanning solutions out there that are focusing on application code base. Within SAP, the Anapsys tool allows you to scan your ABAP code. There are ones for HTML and Java and a number of application scanning solutions out there. So I'd focus on those. One from Steve Rumsby here. Several times you mentioned password rotation, but that goes a little bit against NCSC's current guidance and others. Should we be treating user and admin accounts slightly differently in that regard?
Absolutely, yeah. So the NCSC advice is more down to the human, the day-to-day BAU account, if you will, right? So as mentioned, usually, my David.Higgins account in the CyberArk domain changing, on a regular basis. That's kind of what NCSC is saying is as long as that's really strong and unique and we're using different ways for me to authenticate, that's probably the better approach. The challenge we've got is actually under the covers, we rack a Windows server in the data center, very old school, right? But you kind of get my point. There's a built-in admin account to it, which authenticates with a password, right? When we move into the domain space and we've got users connecting to systems with a domain administrator or something similar sitting in a group and they're connecting with AD credentials, it's depositing hashes on those servers as it authenticates through. Now, if we don't rotate the credential in that situation, an attacker can harvest that cred and then utilize it to move elsewhere in a Kerberos-style attack. So this is where the best practice of recycling those accounts on a more than just periodic basis, but also after use becomes hugely important. Because absolutely, to your question, we should treat the way that we control our users and our admin users very differently, because they're coveted differently, they're used differently, and they of course, are targeted differently.
Yeah, I completely agree. One is about not increasing the complexity to the point where people bypass security. Yeah. The other is about a known account and trying to ensure that you're securing that one better. And you're talking about a much smaller, much more mature user community of these privileged accounts. Yeah. We've got time, I think, for one more question. And this one is SAP specific. How do we use privileged account management or privileged access management for RFC and technical accounts used in the SAP? We're expecting to rotate the password, but the connections are critical, so maybe not able to rotate those passwords as easily.
Gotcha. Yeah, so I can. So you're right. So in certain situations, whenever we look at privileged accounts across the whole spectrum, there are always going to be varying complexities to managing them. Some are more straightforward than others, and some need more consideration. When it comes to things like SAP, we've already built a lot. And sorry, now I'm very much putting my vendor hat on. Right, we've already built a lot of integration with SAP so that we can do credential rotation and even do some of the session management that I talked about before. So that brokering of sessions into, say, the GUI. So there is already, a lot of integration that's been done to help facilitate that. However, what you should always do is consider the criticality of the account. If there is concern that perhaps, connectivity isn't always there, what you ultimately have to do is kind of create a category of controls for your different account types. You rate accounts based on its complexity, but also its risk. and apply the right level of controls being regular credential rotation, session brokering and recording, least privilege enforcement, so on and so forth. So there may be situations you'll find that are hugely complicated from a technical perspective that actually we can't put the full stack of controls against. But when it comes to SAP, generally there's a lot of great integration that already exists.
And I think one of the things you highlighted throughout your presentation was, stick to that principle of least privilege. And just because an ID is used as an RFC or a connection user within the SAP system, it still doesn't need SAP all assigned to it. It doesn't need to be able to execute any function module or function group within the application. And there are ways to identify what those privileges should be. So continue to apply those principles.
Really good point.
If you could just go on to the next slide quickly.
Yeah,
I just wanted to quickly refresh everybody's memory as to what we've got coming up. So at 11 o'clock, we've got a panel discussion about prioritizing your cyber defense spend and how to secure your budgets. Then we've got the lunch and learn sessions where you can learn something about the solutions in these spaces. And then we'll be talking about the outsider threat and securing against some of the common vulnerabilities, which will extend from what David so expertly briefed us on this morning. After that, Vincent Du from SAP is talking to us about enterprise threat detection and integrating that, which will then lead us on to some penetration testing and prioritization of vulnerability assessments before we wrap up today to say, is the problem in the chair, not the computer, and securing the human level, which again ties very well back to this account and credential misuse that we've been talking about. David, thank you so much for your time today. Really interesting as ever. And hopefully people have got a lot out of it.
Perfect. Thank you, Tom. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much.